The apartment was small but tidy, perched on the third floor of a brick building that had been standing since the 1960s. It smelled faintly of brewed coffee and something older, dust caught in the pages of books that hadn't been moved in years. From the outside, nothing about the place stood out. A row of similar buildings lined the street, each with the same peeling green paint on the balcony rails and the same tired mailboxes downstairs. But inside apartment 3B, something waited in silence. The living room looked ordinary at first glance. A beige couch faced a small TV. A stack of magazines sat on the coffee table, next to a mug that still held the faint scent of tea. But on the far wall, hanging where most people would put a painting or a family photo, there was a calendar. It wasn't a store-bought one with pictures of flowers or landscapes. It was hand-drawn, large numbers written in black marker, starting from 60 and counting down, one day at a time, to 0. The days had been crossed off with a single red line, each stroke sharp and deliberate. The air in the room was still, the kind of stillness that feels heavier than quiet should. Outside, the city went on as normal. Cars passed, kids shouted on their way home from school. But here, time felt different, almost trapped inside those four walls. Before it became a crime scene, this was just home to two people who, from a distance, seemed perfectly unremarkable. He was the kind of man who blended into a crowd without effort, tall but slightly hunched, with clothes that looked chosen for comfort rather than style. He worked long hours at an accounting firm downtown, the sort of job that kept him in front of spreadsheets and made him invisible to most people who passed him on the street. She was younger by several years, quiet but with a presence you noticed when she looked directly at you. She had a way of holding your gaze a second longer than most, as if measuring something. She worked part-time at a bookstore, spending the rest of her hours at home. People in the building didn't see her much, but when they did, she was polite, even warm, though no one could say they knew her. They lived simply, but not carelessly. Groceries were put away as soon as they came in. Bills were paid on time. The apartment was never messy. From the outside, they might have looked like the picture of a calm domestic life. But that calendar, bold, unavoidable, and counting down, hinted at something else entirely. In the weeks before the countdown began, life in the apartment had already shifted in ways too subtle for outsiders to see. Conversations were shorter. The TV played longer into the night. Sometimes, muffled voices could be heard through the walls, low and tense, the kind of tones that didn't match the words themselves. That IT wasn't money, at least not at first. He made enough to cover the bills, and her part-time work filled in the rest. But control has many forms, and his was built into the everyday, the way he handled the rent payments without letting her see the statements, the way he decided what brand of coffee they bought, the way he asked where she'd been even when she'd just gone for a short walk. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, constant, and hard to point to directly. She didn't push back often. When she did, it was in small ways, buying a different type of bread than he liked, staying at the bookstore a little longer to talk to a customer, leaving a lamp on when she knew he preferred darkness. These were small rebellions, almost invisible on their own, but together they started to shift the air between them. In 01 in the building noticed the change, though a few neighbors later said they had a feeling. What they had seen was only the surface, him carrying groceries in one hand and holding the door for her with the other, her smiling faintly as she passed in the hallway. What they hadn't seen was the way those moments ended once the door closed behind them. When a calendar appeared on the wall, it was late winter. She'd been the one to hang it, though she never said why. The first number at the top was 60. Every night, she crossed off a day in red ink. He didn't ask at first, but his eyes kept drifting toward it. By the time it reached 45, the questions began, soft at first, then sharper. What's it for? Why won't you tell me? She only smiled in a way that wasn't a smile, and said it was just something to keep track of. But the truth was that both of them knew it meant something. Neither of them was willing to say what. The days kept ticking down, each red line cutting a little deeper into whatever normalcy they had left. And as the numbers fell, so did the fragile sense of safety inside apartment 3B. When the calendar reached 0, the police would come. But in those quiet, narrowing days before, The countdown had already done something irreversible. It had turned their lives into a clock neither of them could stop. The calendar was at 44 when the first real crack in their routine appeared. It was a Tuesday evening, already dark outside, when he came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with her coat still on. The grocery bags she'd brought in were untouched, still slouched on the floor by the door. She didn't look at him when he asked what was wrong, just kept tapping her fingers against the tabletop in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It wasn't until he reached for the bags that she finally spoke. "I saw you," she said quietly. Without looking up, he didn't know what she meant. At least, that's what he claimed. She explained, voice low, about the woman outside his office building, the one she'd seen him talking to for what looked like far too long. His laugh had been too easy, his hand brushing the woman's arm in a way that wasn't just friendly. He denied it, of course, but his tone was too quick, too practiced. It wasn't a fight that night. Not yet. But it was the first time her question stayed hanging in the air long after the words stopped. For 39 days, a different kind of tension showed itself. She came home later than usual from the bookstore. When he asked why, she said she'd stopped for coffee with a friend. He asked who, and when she said, just someone from work, the pause between her words was enough to make him lean forward in his chair, studying her face. She held his gaze, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet defiance, that he'd never seen before. That night, he checked her phone while she was in the shower. He didn't find anything, but it didn't matter. The act itself planted something in him, a need to know everything, to watch more closely. Money began to weave itself into the cracks. His hours at work had been cut without warning, and while he told her it was temporary, the worry sat heavy on his shoulders. Bills were still paid, but the leftover cushion began to shrink. He stopped going out for lunch at work, started keeping receipts for even the smallest purchases. She noticed, and while she offered to pick up extra shifts at the bookstore, he waved it off. But deep down, he didn't want her earning more than she already did. He told himself it was about pride, but it was also about control. By day 31, the arguments had grown sharper, but never loud enough for the neighbors to complain. The walls between them weren't built with shouting. They were built with long silences, with sentences that trailed off before they reached their point. Once, she left the apartment in the middle of an argument, her footsteps echoing down the stairwell. He didn't follow, but when she came back 2 hours later, his phone sat on the coffee table, open to a text message she'd never seen before. It was from a number she didn't recognize, and the words were short. "When can we meet again?" She asked about it, but he brushed it aside as someone from work. Still, she didn't forget it. In return, she started leaving the apartment earlier in the mornings, saying she wanted to get some air before work. Sometimes she came back with the faint smell of cigarettes clinging to her hair, even though she didn't smoke. It was around this time that the calendar began to take on a different meaning. At first, it had been her quiet project, something only she seemed to understand. But now he looked at it every day, standing in front of it for long moments, his eyes narrowing. He began to ask what would happen on 0 day. His voice sometimes light, sometimes sharp. She never answered directly, only saying, "You'll see." The closer the numbers dropped toward 20, the more the apartment seemed to close in on itself. The air felt heavy, like there wasn't enough room for both of them inside. Little things became fuel for something larger. A misplaced receipt, a missed call, a tone of voice that felt like an insult, even if it wasn't meant that way. One night around day 18, he found a small notebook in the drawer of her nightstand. It was filled with short entries, some only a sentence or two. Most were about ordinary things, what she'd read that day, the weather, what they'd eaten for dinner. But here and there, the tone shifted. One entry read, "Sometimes I think the only way to be free is to disappear." Another, "Every day feels like a step towards something I can't undo." He put the notebook back exactly where he found it, but the words stayed in his mind, circling .by day 14. Even the neighbors began to notice that the couple in 3B seemed different. A woman from the second floor, who often passed them on the stairs, later said she'd seen them walking home one evening, not speaking to each other. He walked several steps ahead, his shoulders tight, while she trailed behind, eyes fixed on the ground. There were other things, small, unsettling details. A drawer in the kitchen was locked now, when it had never been before. He kept the key on his keychain. Once, when he was at work, she tried to open it with a butter knife. Inside, she found nothing more than a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it slowly, her hands shaking. The paper held a list of dates: her birthday, the day they met, the day they moved in together, and one final date she didn't recognize. She didn't ask about it right away. She waited, and the waiting was almost worse than knowing. When the calendar reached single digits, the apartment felt like it was holding its breath. They both moved more carefully, as if any sudden motion could set something off. Conversations became edged with a strange politeness, the kind that isn't about kindness at all, but about keeping the peace just long enough that on the night of day 5, a storm rolled in, rattling the windows. They sat in the living room, the TV on but ignored. At one point, the power flickered, and she said softly, "It's almost here." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't have to. The days that followed were slow but sharp, each one stretching out while also pushing them closer to something neither could turn away from. By day 2, they weren't even pretending anymore. The questions had stopped, replaced by a quiet watching. She moved around the apartment, like someone counting the steps to an exit. He stayed close, like someone guarding a door. The countdown was almost over. And in that narrow space between numbers, the air was so tense it felt like even the walls were listening that it was supposed to be just another evening. But even before the first sound was made, the air had that unnatural stillness, a pause that felt deliberate, like the whole world had turned its head to listen. The apartment was dim. Only the kitchen light was on, casting a pale yellow wash across the floor. Rain slid down the windows in thin, quick rivulets, tapping at the glass with a sound that was too soft to drown out the noise inside their heads. The calendar on the wall read 0. The red marker she had been using for weeks was still uncapped on the counter, its tip drying in the air. He was already in the living room when she came in from the hallway, her coat still on, her hand curled tight around something in her pocket. He didn't speak at first. His eyes went to the calendar, then to her face. It was only a second's glance, but it was enough to register that she was calmer than he'd expected, calm in a way that made his stomach tighten. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he said finally, his voice flat. "I thought you'd be smarter," she replied. Almost under her breath, he moved toward her, slow, deliberate. She didn't step back. Their shadows tangled together on the wall, growing and shrinking with each step. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed, a dog barked, and then silence again. The argument began low, both of them speaking in measured tones, but it swelled quickly, like heat building under a lid. She accused him of the woman from the office, the lies about the money, and the list of dates she'd found in the locked drawer. He threw her words back at her. Secret meetings, the smell of smoke, the notebook full of thoughts she should never have written down. That IT happened fast after that, the kind of speed that later makes it impossible to remember who moved first. She pulled the object from her pocket, small, metallic, the weight of it familiar in her palm. He saw it and stepped forward anyway, his face twisted into something halfway between rage and disbelief. "You're not going to do anything," he said, but there was a tremor in it. The first sound was deafening in the close space of the living room. It wasn't until much later that either of them realized the neighbors hadn't heard it. Either the storm had covered it, or no one wanted to admit they had. The metallic tang of blood reached the air almost instantly, sharp and impossible to ignore. She stood there, breathing hard, the weapon still in her hand. He staggered backward, his hand pressed to his side, eyes wide not just with pain, but with something like betrayal. "You planned this," he said, his voice breaking. She didn't answer. In the seconds that followed, the room seemed to fold in on itself. The ticking of the clock became unbearable. She watched him sink toward the floor, her heartbeat loud enough to drown out the storm outside. For a moment, just a flicker, there was hesitation. Her grip on the weapon loosened. Her mind screamed to stop, to call for help, to undo what had just happened. But then his hand twitched toward the coffee table, where his phone lay face down, and something in her snapped back into place. She stepped forward, quick, decisive. The second blow was quieter, but final. Silence settled over the apartment in a way that felt different than before. Not just stillness, but absence. She stood there, her chest rising and falling, staring down at the body on the floor. The storm outside had shifted to a soft drizzle, as if the weather itself had grown tired. For a long time, she didn't move. The kitchen light buzzed faintly overhead. The red marker on the counter had rolled an inch closer to the edge. Somewhere, far away, a siren wailed, but it wasn't coming here. Not yet. When she finally moved, it was slow, mechanical. She set the weapon on the counter, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and then tossed it into the laundry basket. She took the calendar off the wall, folded it in half, and stuffed it into a plastic bag. Her FAC was blank. Not the calm from before, but something emptier, as if she'd stepped outside herself. She checked his pockets, taking his wallet and phone. She scrolled through his messages, deleting a few without reading them completely. Then she set the phone back on the coffee table, exactly where it had been, almost as though nothing had changed. When she finally looked at him again, the room felt colder. His eyes were open but unseeing, his expression still holding the faint shape of whatever last thought had passed through him. She stepped closer, crouched, and closed them with her fingertips. There was no crying, no screaming, just the sound of rain against the windows and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. She didn't know yet what she would tell people. Maybe it would be an accident. Maybe self-defense. Maybe she'd disappear before anyone had the chance to ask. For now, there was only the stillness and a strange, terrible relief of knowing the countdown was over. The body lay in the living room until just before dawn. She hadn't moved it, couldn't move it, and by the time the first trace of daylight broke through the curtains, the room felt like it belonged to someone else. She sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't drunk from, eyes fixed on nothing. Every sound felt sharper now. The creak of the pipes, the whine of the refrigerator, the faint hiss of wind outside. It was as if the world had decided to carry on the same, oblivious to the fact that nothing was the same anymore. When she finally stood, her movements were slow, deliberate. She took the laundry basket, the one holding the towel, and stuffed it into a black garbage bag. She scrubbed the counter until her knuckles ached. She changed her shirt twice, each time convinced she could still smell the faint metallic trace of blood on the fabric. But the mind doesn't obey the body in moments like this. As much as she tried to focus on the cleanup, flashes of the night before kept intruding. His face in that last second, the way his voice cracked when he accused her of planning it, the heavy silence afterward. She told herself she had no choice, that it was survival, that it was inevitable. Tea didn't help WY mid-morning. The news had not yet reached the outside world, but the circle closest to them had already begun to stir. His sister, Claire, called twice, both times leaving a voicemail that started casual and ended in irritation. "Call me back. I know you're home." A neighbor across the hall knocked once, then twice before giving up. She heard his footsteps retreat, slow and unsure. The isolation was immediate and suffocating. Every normal sound, the muffled voices from upstairs, the barking dog down the hall, sounded alien, too ordinary to exist, alongside what had happened. When the police eventually arrived, it was not because she called them. It was because Claire, worried by the silence, had decided to come over herself. She saw the lights still on in the kitchen, the curtains drawn tight, and something in her gut told her to force the door. The scene was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The body had cooled. The weapon was still missing, hidden, but not well enough. From that moment on, the process took on its rhythm. Questions, photographs, gloves snapping over hands, murmured instructions between officers. She was escorted into the bedroom to sit while they secured the scene. Her answers were clipped. Sometimes she said nothing at all. She didn't deny what happened, but she didn't explain it either. Not yet. The news broke before nightfall. Local man found dead in apartment. Woman in custody. The photo they used of him was one from his company website. Clean-shaven, smiling, professional. The one they found of her was from years ago, a driver's license shot with flat lighting and no expression. The contrast was damning. Neighbors described him as friendly and hardworking. One said she was quiet and kept to herself. Neither description captured the truth, but truth was no longer the currency of public opinion. Social media lit up with speculation. Some swore they'd seen trouble coming. Others painted her as cold and calculated. A few, very few, wondered if there was more to the story that I in custody. The hours stretched into something shapeless. She replayed the moment over and over, trying to find the exact point it became irreversible. Sometimes she told herself it was when he stepped toward her. Other times she knew it was long before that, maybe years before, when the first betrayal planted itself and quietly grew. Sleep came in jagged fragments, each time yanking her awake with the memory of his eyes. She would lie there in the thin cot, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, her pulse racing in the same rhythm as the night it happened. Guilt didn't come as a wave. It came as a slow leak, seeping in through cracks she didn't even know she had. She caught herself thinking about what she could have done differently, then quickly shut the thought down. She couldn't undo it. She could only survive it. The ripple effects spread wider than she expected. His family fractured almost immediately. Claire refused to speak to their parents, convinced they'd known more than they admitted. Old resentments surfaced, arguments over money, over childhood slights, over the women who had come and gone from his life. Friends split into camps. Those who painted her as a manipulative predator, and those who quietly admitted they'd seen his darker side. A few cut ties altogether, unwilling to choose. The community was unsettled. In a place where gossip usually thrived on small scandals, this was too large, too final. People whispered in grocery store aisles, lowered their voices in coffee shops, and avoided making eye contact when her name was mentioned. The legal machinery began to grind forward, impersonal and methodical. There were hearings, evaluations, motions filed by lawyers who spoke about her in the third person, as though she were a theoretical concept rather than a human being. Each proceeding felt like another layer of herself being stripped away. Not just her freedom, but her identity. She was no longer her. She was the defendant. Her mind was turning against her. She started to dream not of the moment itself, but of small, distorted versions of it. Seeing him in a crowd, reaching for her in an empty room, speaking to her in a voice she couldn't quite recognize. Some mornings she woke up convinced she could smell rain, just like that night, only to remember she hadn't seen the sky in weeks. The story had shifted in the public's mind. At first, it had been about the crime. Now, it was about the trial, the potential sentence, the hidden histories being unearthed in court filings. Her past relationships were dissected. Her finances were analyzed. Every argument they'd ever had was given new weight. Every rumor given air. The person she had been before no longer existed outside of her memory. And yet, through all of it, she never once told the full story. Some things, she decided, belonged to the silence. The trial ended not with a shocking twist, but with the kind of quiet inevitability that made it feel as though the outcome had been decided long before the first witness took the stand. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Their decision was unanimous. She was sentenced to 22 years. There was no audible gasp in the courtroom, no sudden outcry, just the shuffle of papers, the scrape of chairs, and a low murmur of voices resuming their usual tone. It was as if the building itself exhaled. She stood there, hands clasped loosely in front of her, listening to the judge's words with an expression that was neither relief nor despair. It was something quieter, acceptance maybe, or resignation. For his family, the sentence offered only partial closure. Claire attended every day of the trial, her arms always crossed, her expression unwavering. When a verdict came, she didn't cry. She simply nodded once, as if confirming a fact she had already known. But grief is a way of lingering even when justice has been served. She admitted to friends that she still caught herself expecting her brother's number to light up her phone. She still saved a seat for him at Christmas. She still replayed their last conversation, wondering if there was something in her voice he had heard but never mentioned. Her own family fractured under the weight of the verdict. Some stopped visiting, unable to face the sight of her in the prison's visitor room. Others wrote letters that grew shorter over time, their words shrinking to the size of polite updates. Her mother came twice a month without fail, each time bringing a small bag of approved items, books, stationery, instant coffee packets. She never spoke about the crime itself. Instead, she talked about the garden, the weather, and the neighbor's new dog. It was their unspoken agreement. The past was fixed, and the present was all that could be tended to in the years that followed. The case faded for national headlines, but lingered locally as a cautionary tale that was used in criminology lectures. It appeared in a paperback true crime collection, wedged between other stories of domestic tragedy. Podcasts debated whether the sentence had been too harsh or not harsh enough. Strangers continued to speculate, sometimes with remarkable confidence, about what really happened that night. Some claimed it was an act of cold calculation. Others saw it as a desperate reaction to long-buried tensions. The truth, as always, was more complicated and locked away in the minds of those who had lived it on a broader scale. The crime sparked quiet but significant conversations about domestic disputes, self-defense laws, and the invisible lines that divide victim from perpetrator. Advocacy groups pointed to the case as an example of how the legal system struggles to handle situations with complex interpersonal histories. Others used it to argue for clearer legislation around what constitutes imminent threat. For every person who saw the verdict as proof that justice was blind, there was another who saw it as a failure to account for context. As for her, prison became both punishment and sanctuary. She learned the rhythms of the place quickly, when the halls were busiest, which guards were approachable, or to stand to catch the last bit of afternoon sun in the yard. She kept her head down, avoided alliances, and filled her time with books and carefully measured routines. Her letters became more introspective over time. She wrote about the strange comfort of repetition, about the way seasons felt different when you could only watch them through bars, about the moments when guilt would sneak up on her without warning. She never described the night itself. In the rare moments when she allowed herself to think of the outside world, she found that her memories had softened at the edges, like photographs left too long in the sun. She remembered their first apartment together, the chipped tile, the crooked blinds, the way the floorboards creaked near the kitchen. She remembered his laugh in the early years, before things turned. She remembered the weight of loving someone and the even heavier weight of realizing that love was not enough to keep either of them safe. The public, of course, had moved on. Other crimes took the spotlight. Other names filled the news cycle. But for those directly touched by the event, the shadow never fully receded. Claire eventually stopped speaking about her brother in public, not because she had forgotten him, but because she had grown tired of hearing people try to rewrite him in their minds, turning him into either a saint or a villain, when he had been neither. Her mother continued to visit until her health declined. When she could no longer make the trip, she sent letters, each one ending with the same line, "You're still my daughter." Looking back, the case revealed uncomfortable truths, not just about the individuals involved, but about the way society navigates morality. People like to think of justice as a clean equation: action, consequence, resolution. But the reality is messy. Justice, in its human form, is an intersection of law, perception, and narrative. It is as much about what can be proven as it is about what happened. Power dynamics complicate that equation further. In relationships, romantic or otherwise, control can shift subtly, invisibly, until one person finds themselves in a position they never imagined occupying. And when the balance tips too far, the result can be explosive. This story was not just about one fatal night. It was about years of decisions, compromises, silences, and small betrayals that accumulated like sediment until something finally broke. Was justice served? In the strictest legal sense, perhaps. A crime was committed, the law responded, and a sentence was carried out, but justice, as lived by those left behind, is more elusive. His life was gone. Hers was reduced to a narrow corridor and a steel door. Families were fractured, reputations dismantled, futures rewritten. There was no real victory. only the rearrangement of grief into something bearable enough to carry. Underscore in the end, the case became less about guilt or innocence and more about the fragility of human bonds, about how quickly love can turn into something unrecognizable, about how people can hurt each other in ways that are both sudden and years in the making. The courtroom closed. The news cycle shifted. But in living rooms, classrooms, and quiet conversations, the story continued. Not as a headline, but as a reminder. The line between victim and perpetrator is often thinner than we think. That morality is rarely absolute, and that sometimes the most haunting truths are the ones that never make it into evidence.